السلام عليكم ورحمة الله عزيزنا طلبة. Today, inshallah, we are going to continue our macroeconomics lessons or to finish the macroeconomic course by this lesson. This is the last or the fourth chapter of part about the business cycle theory or the economy in the short run. And this will be our last lesson about the aggregate supply and the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You have to know that most economists analyze the short-run fluctuations in national income and the price level using the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. In the previous three chapters, we examined the aggregate demand in some detail, the ISL model and also the Mandel-Fleming model in the open economy. It shows how changes in monetary and fiscal policy and shocks to the economy, to the money and goods markets shift the aggregate demand curve. In this chapter, we turn our attention to the aggregate supply and develop theories that explain the position and the slope of the aggregate supply curve. Okay. So when we introduced the aggregate supply, if you remember in chapter 10, aggregate supply curve, we established that aggregate supply behaves differently in the short run than in the long run, right? In the long run, prices are flexible and aggregate supply curve is vertical. So when the aggregate supply curve is vertical, shifts in the aggregate demand curve affects the price level. Price will be rise and fall and so on, but the output of the economy remains at its natural level because the aggregate supply curve is vertical. By contrast, in short run, prices are sticky. Okay, so the aggregate supply curve is not vertical. In this case, shifts in aggregate demand do cause fluctuations in the output, or Y we denoted by Y. We will see in details. So in chapter 10, we took a simplified view of price stickiness by drawing the short-run aggregate supply curve as a horizontal line, representing the extreme situation in which all prices are fixed. Okay, so our task now is to refine this understanding of short-run aggregate supply to better reflect the real world in which some prices are sticky and others are not. After examining the basic theory of the short-run aggregate supply curve, we establish a key implication. We show that this curve implies a trade-off between two measures of economic performance, inflation and unemployment. This trade-off called the Phillips curve, if you remember, which tells us that to reduce the rate of inflation, policymakers must temporarily raise unemployment, and to reduce unemployment, they must accept higher inflation and so on. So the trade-off between inflation and unemployment is only temporary. Okay. So one goal of this chapter is to explain why policymakers face such a trade-off in the short run, and just as important, why they do not face it in the long run. So we will learn in this chapter three models of aggregate supply in which output depends positively on the price level in the short run, about the short run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, known as Phillips curve. Let's talk first about the three models of aggregate supply, which are the sticky wage model, when the wage is sticky, the imperfect information model, and the sticky price model. Okay, all three models imply this equation. As you know, the aggregate output equals the natural rate of output plus this positive parameter multiplied by the actual price level minus the expected price level. Okay, so assume that firms and workers negotiate contracts and fix the nominal wage before they know what the price level will turn out to be. So the nominal wage they set is the product of a target real wage and the expected price level will be like that. So now we are talking about the first model, the sticky wage model, assuming that firms and workers negotiate contracts and fix the nominal wage before they know what price level in the market will turn out. So the nominal wage, W, is the product of a target real wage, which is this like small w, and the expected price level. Okay, the nominal wage will be the product of the target real wage multiplied by the expected price level. So if it turns out that the actual price equals the expected price, so the unemployment and output are at their natural rate. If it turns out that actual price will be more than the expected price, so this real wages is less than its target. So firms hire more workers and output rises above its natural rate. And if the actual price turns out less than the expected price, the real wage exceeds its target. So firms hire fewer workers and output falls below its natural rate. So the sticky wage model implies that the real wage should be counter-cyclical, the real wage, as it should move in the opposite direction as output during business cycles. Let's see, in the booms, when actual price typically rises, the real wages should fall. And in recessions, when the actual price typically falls, the real wage should rise. This is why it's counter-cyclical. So this prediction in the real world doesn't come true, as you can see here. The cyclical behavior of real wages in different years in the United States, you can see there is no perfect relation between the percent change in real wage and the percent change in real GDP. Second model is the imperfect information. The assumptions of this model: all wages and prices are perfectly flexible, and all markets are clear. So each supplier produces one good, consumes many goods. Each supplier knows the nominal price of the good he or she will produce, but doesn't know the overall price level. This is the assumptions of our model. So supply of each good depends on its relative price. The nominal price of the good divided by the overall price, the relative price. The nominal price of the good divided by the overall price. So supplier doesn't know price level at the time she makes her production decision, so uses the expected price level, as supplier doesn't know the price level at the time he or she makes his production decision, so they use the expected price level. Suppose that the actual price rises, but the expected price doesn't rise. In this case, supplier thinks her relative price has risen, so she produces more. With many producers thinking this way, the output will rise whenever the actual price rises above the expected price. Third model, the sticky price. Reasons for sticky prices: first, we have the long-term contracts between firms and customers. This is why the price sticks for a period of time. Also, menu costs. The shops, magazines, restaurants, and so on, they will not change their menu with their prices in short terms. Also, firms not wishing to annoy customers with frequent price changes. So assumptions: firms set their own prices as in the monopolistic competition. And individual firms' desired price is, as you can see here in our equation, where the alpha is the parameter, positive parameter, any number more than 0. So suppose two types of firms with flexible prices set prices as above. Okay, so firms with sticky prices must set their price before they know how the actual price and the output will turn out. So assume sticky price firms expect that output will equals its natural rate, then the price will be equal to the expected price. To derive the aggregate supply curve, we first find an expression for the overall price level. Let S denote the fraction of firms with sticky prices, fraction of firms with sticky prices, denoted with S. Then we can write the overall price level. As you can see, price set here, the price set by sticky price firms, and this is the price set by flexible price firms. If we subtract 1 minus the fraction of firms that use sticky price multiplied by the actual price from both sides, so divide both sides by S, you can find this a high expected price will lead to high actual price. Firms expect high prices, then firms that must set prices in advance will set them high. Other firms respond by setting also high prices. We have high output, then we expect high price. When income is high, sorry, if we have high income, so there will be high price. So when income is high, the demand for goods is high. So firms with flexible prices set high prices. The greater the fraction of flexible price firms, the smaller is S, the fraction of the sticky price firms, and the bigger is the effect of the change in income on price. So finally, derive the aggregate supply equation by solving for the income. In contrast to the sticky wage model, the sticky price model implies a pro-cyclical real wage, in contrast to the counter-cyclical real wage. Now, suppose aggregate output or income falls, then firms see a fall in demand for their products. Firms with sticky prices reduce production and hence reduce their demand for labor. The leftward shift in labor demand causes the real wage to fall. So the summary and implication of these models, each of the three models of aggregate supply imply the relationship summarized by the short-run aggregate supply curve and equation. As you can see here, the long-run aggregate supply, the vertical curve, the output is constant, and in the short run, you can see it is changeable according to the price level. Okay. So when we add the aggregate demand curve to our graph, suppose a positive aggregate demand shock moves the output above its natural rate. Yani will move this and the Y bar. If there is a positive shock to the aggregate demand, it will shift to the right from AD1 to AD2. So the output or Y will move to this intersection to Y2. It's above the natural rate, and then the price will be above the level people has expected. It will be from P1 to P2. So the actual price will be more than the expected price. Over time, the expected price rises also. Short run aggregate supply shifts up. So the output returns back to its natural rate and the expected according to the increase in the expected price. So this was the three models of the aggregate supply and the short run. Now let's talk about the inflation and unemployment and the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve states that inflation depends on the expected inflation, the cyclical unemployment, the deviation of the actual rate of unemployment from the natural rate. This are also the supply shocks, or denoted with this Greek letter. So this is what the equation of the Phillips curve, or what it states, that the inflation depends on, as you can see, inflation equals the expected inflation minus beta, or the positive parameter, multiplied by the unemployment, or the minus the natural rate of the unemployment, plus the supply shock. If you are interested, this is how we derive the Phillips curve equation from the short-run aggregate supply. So now we have the equation of the short-run aggregate supply and the equation of the Phillips curve, or inflation. The short-run aggregate supply curve output is related to unexpected movements in the price level, but in Phillips curves, unemployment is related to unexpected movements in inflation rates. Okay, adaptive expectations, an approach that assumes people form their expectations of future inflation based on recently observed inflation. Simple example, expected inflation equals last year's actual inflation. This is the adaptive expectations. So this is how the PC, or the Phillips curves equation, becomes like this. You will put the last year's actual inflation, which is inflation minus 1. This is for the minus a year, yani, instead of the expected inflation. In this form, the Phillips curve implies that inflation has interior. Interior in the absence, this is the meaning of interior, absence of supply shocks or cyclical unemployment. Inflation will continue indefinitely at its current rate, as there is no cyclical unemployment or supply shocks. Past inflation influences expectations of current inflation, which in turn influences the wages and prices that people set. We have two causes of rising and falling of inflation according to this equation also. The cost push inflation, which means inflation resulting from supply shocks. Cost push inflation. Adverse supply shocks typically raise production costs and induce firms to raise the prices. So this is pushing inflation up. Also, the demand pull inflation. Inflation resulting from demand shocks. Demand pull inflation. Positive shocks to aggregate demand cause unemployment to fall below its natural rate, which pulls the inflation rate up. Graphing the Phillips curve, in the short run, policymakers face a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, as you know. Okay, people adjust their expectations over time, so the trade-off only holds in the short run. For example, an increase in the expected inflation shifts the short-run Phillips curve upward. The sacrifice ratio. To reduce inflation, policymakers can contract aggregate demand, causing unemployment to rise above the natural rate. So the sacrifice ratio measures the percentage of a year's real GDP that must be forgone or sacrificed to reduce inflation by 1 percentage point. The sacrifice ratio measures the percentage of a year's real GDP that must be forgone to reduce inflation by 1%. This is why the policymakers, to reduce inflation, they can contract the aggregate demand to cause unemployment to rise above the natural rate. So a typical estimate of the ratio of this sacrifice ratio is 5. Example, to reduce inflation from 6 to 2%, if the inflation rate is 6% and you want to reduce it to 2%, you must sacrifice 20% of 1 year's GDP. How you know that? GDP loss, you will multiply the inflation reduction, which is the difference between 6 and 2, multiplied by the sacrifice ratio that we said it is the 5. So it will be 20% of year's GDP you have to reduce the inflation. This loss in the GDP could be incurred in 1 year, or you can spread over several years. For example, 5% loss for each of the 4 years. This year 5%, next year for 4 years, مثلا, each year 5%, so you will have 20% sacrifice of the GDP. The cost of this inflation is lost GDP. Disinflation, reducing inflation. One could use Occam's law to translate this cost into unemployment. Ways of modeling the formation of expectations. You have the adaptive expectations, as we said before. People base their expectations of future inflation on recently observed inflation, right? Also have the rational expectations. People base their expectations on all available information, including information about current and prospective future policies. This is the difference between the adaptive expectations and rational expectations. How can we reach a painless disinflation? Yani without loss of GDP. Proponents of rational expectations believe that the sacrifice ratio may be very small. Suppose the unemployment equals the natural rate of unemployment, and the inflation equals the expected inflation, which equals 6%. And suppose the Fed or the central bank announces that it will do whatever is necessary to reduce inflation from 6 to 2% as soon as possible. So if the announcement is credible, then the expected inflation will fall, perhaps by the full 4 points. And inflation can fall without an increase in unemployment. Okay. Calculating the sacrifice ratio for the bulk of this inflation. In 1981, inflation rate was 9.7%. In 1985, inflation became 3%. So the total disinflation was 6.7%. As you can see, can compare how this affects the unemployment rate also. From previous slide, inflation fell by 0.7%. Total cyclical employment was 9.5%. So Occam's law, 1% of unemployment equals 2% of lost output. So 9.5% cyclical unemployment equals 19% of a year's real GDP. As you know, sacrifice ratio is the loss of GDP divided by total disinflation. So we'll divide 19% divided by 6.7% equals 2.8 percentage points of GDP were lost for each 1 percentage point reduction in inflation. The natural rate hypothesis. Our analysis of course of disinflation and of economic fluctuations in the preceding chapters is based on the natural rate hypothesis. How changes in aggregate demand affects output and employment only in the short run. In the long run, the economy returns to the levels of output, employment, and unemployment described by the classical model that we saw. An alternative hypothesis, the hysteresis. Stresses the long-lasting influence of history on variables such as natural rate of unemployment. Negative shocks may increase the natural rate of unemployment, so economy may not fully recover. So why negative shocks may increase the natural rate? The skills of the cyclically unemployed workers may deteriorate while unemployed, and they may not find a job when the recession ends. So cyclically unemployed workers may lose their influence on wage setting. Then insiders, the employed workers, may bargain for higher wages for themselves. And the result will be that the cyclically unemployed outsiders may become structurally unemployed when the recession ends. Okay, so this was the aggregate supply on the short run. Let's take a summary of our lesson. We will have three models of aggregate supply in short run: the sticky wage model, the imperfect information model, and the sticky price model. And all these three models imply that output rises above its natural rate when the price level rises above the expected price level. Also, we talk about the Phillips curve, derived from the short-run aggregate supply curve, states that inflation depends on the expected inflation, cyclical unemployment, and the supply shocks, and presents policymakers with a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Third, we saw how people form expectations of inflation. There is the adaptive expectations based on recently observed inflation, implies inertia. Also, the rational expectations based on all available information implies that this inflation may be painless. Finally, the natural rate hypothesis and the hysteresis. The natural rate hypothesis that states the changes in aggregate demand can only affect output and employment in the short run. Hysteresis states that aggregate demand can have permanent effects on output and on employment. And this is our key terms for this lesson, this chapter. Now we ended our lessons for this macroeconomics course. I hope you enjoyed it. It was useful. Wish you all the best of luck. So I have to thank you, my dear students. Wish you all the best of luck. See you soon, inshallah. Goodbye and good luck.